I was born and raised in Texas, and if there's one thing my father taught me early on, it's that a man's land is his castle, and it's his duty to protect it. When I turned 35, I bought myself a 200-acre ranch out near the county line, far enough from the city that you could see the stars at night, close enough that my wife could still drive into town when she needed to. We built our dream home there, a sprawling ranch house with wide porches on both sides and a big oak tree out front that shaded the driveway. My wife, Emily, fell in love with the place instantly, and when our 2 kids were born, Jacob and Lily, it felt like everything I'd worked for had finally paid off. The land had good soil for grazing, a small pond fed by a natural spring, and a barn I converted into a workshop for my side business restoring old trucks. This was supposed to be our peaceful escape from the chaos of city life, a place where my kids could run barefoot through the grass, and my wife could sip coffee on the porch without worrying about noise, traffic, or crime. For a while, it really was perfect. But perfection doesn't last forever, and it sure as hell doesn't last when there's an HOA involved. The Homeowners Association didn't even exist when I bought the property. Back then, we were all independent ranchers, neighbors who waved at each other over the fence line, and minded our own business. Then a developer bought up a land just east of mine and built a fancy gated community, 2-story brick houses, manicured lawns, and driveways full of SUVs. At first, I didn't mind. Progress is progress, and as long as they stayed on their side of the fence, I didn't care what they did with their land. But soon enough, they formed an HOA, and it didn't take long before they started sticking their noses where they didn't belong. They started sending letters, first polite, then increasingly aggressive, complaining about everything from the color of my barn to the unsightly cattle I kept grazing near their property line. One of them even had the nerve to knock on my door and suggest I get rid of my old farm truck because it was, quote, lowering the property value of the neighborhood. I told him in no uncertain terms I didn't live in their neighborhood and that my land was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. He left fuming, and that's when the trouble really started. Emily tried to keep me calm through it all. She knew I had a temper when it came to people disrespecting my property, and she didn't want things to escalate. We started keeping the gate locked and installed cameras along the perimeter. For a while, that seemed to work. The letters slowed down, the complaints stopped, and I thought maybe they had finally gotten the message. But then I started noticing signs that someone had been on my land when we weren't home. At first, it was little things. Tire tracks in the dirt road leading to back pasture, a gate left unlatched, footprints where there shouldn't have been any. Then, one evening, I found one of my calves dead near the fence line, its neck broken. There were boot prints leading back toward the subdivision. That was the first time I felt real anger, the kind of anger that gets under your skin and doesn't go away. I reported it to the sheriff's department, but they didn't do much more than take a statement and promise to keep an eye out. Out here, we take care of our own problems, and I was starting to realize I might have to do just that. I started spending more time outside, checking the fence line every morning before sunrise and every evening before bed. I taught Jacob, who was 12, how to ride the ATV so he could help me patrol. He loved it, said it made him feel like a cowboy from the old days. Lily, who was only 8, didn't really understand what was going on, but she could sense the tension. She stopped playing outside after dark and started sleeping in our bed when she got scared at night. Emily was worried, not just about the HOA, but about me. She said I was getting too obsessed, that I was letting them get inside my head. Maybe she was right, but I couldn't just sit back and wait for something worse to happen. My family's safety was my responsibility, and I wasn't about to gamble with that. One Saturday afternoon, I was working the barn when I heard the dogs barking like crazy. They only bark like that when there's someone they don't recognize nearby. I grabbed my rifle. It was always loaded and leaning just inside the barn door, and stepped outside. Sure enough, there was a man standing on my property, right past the no trespassing sign I'd put up months ago. He was tall, wearing jeans and a polo shirt, with a clipboard in one hand and something shiny in the other. I yelled at him to stop right where he was, and he did, but he didn't look scared. In fact, he looked annoyed, like I was the one in the wrong. He said he was from the HOA and that they'd voted to inspect my property for code violations. I told him he had 3 seconds to turn around and get back on the side of the fence. He smirked and said, "This whole area is under HOA governance now. You're going to have to comply." That's when Emily came running out of the house, telling me to lower the rifle. The kids were watching from the porch, wide-eyed and silent. I didn't want to scare them any more than they already were, so I lowered the gun, but I made sure to tell that man that if he ever set foot on my property again without my permission, he wouldn't walk away so easily next time. He left. But the way he looked at me as he went back to his SUV sent a chill down my spine. Something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, I barely slept. I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the feed from the security cameras, waiting for something to happen. Around 2 in the morning, I saw headlights near the back pasture. I grabbed my rifle again, threw on my boots, and headed out with the dogs. By the time I got there, the truck was gone, but the fence had been cut clean through. Whoever had been on my land again, and this time they'd done real damage. I patched the fence, but my blood was boiling. Emily begged me to call the sheriff again, but I knew they'd just tell me the same thing they always did. This was beyond them now. This was personal. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach and a mind racing faster than I could keep up with. I had spent half the night staring out into the dark, thinking about that cut fence, about the man from the HOA with a smug grin, about my kids sleeping just a few yards away from where strangers had walked onto our land like they owned it. I've dealt with thieves before, back when I was younger. I caught a couple of drifters trying to siphon gas from my trucks and ran them off without a second thought. But this felt different. This wasn't random. This was targeted. And if someone was willing to break a fence and kill one of my calves, what was stopping them from coming closer, from knocking on my door in the middle of the night, from hurting the people I love most? That thought kept circling through my head like a buzzard. And every time I tried to brush it off, it came back louder. I tried to go about the day like normal, but normal wasn't possible anymore. Emily could tell I was on edge, and she kept giving me that look, the one where she doesn't say anything but her eyes tell me she's worried. I kept my rifle closer than usual, even when I was working. Jacob asked me if we could do another perimeter check, and I said yes, partly because I wanted to keep him close, partly because I wanted to see with his own eyes what we were up against. We drove the ATV along the fence line, and I showed him the section I'd patched up in the middle of the night. He frowned, didn't say much, but I could see the way he tightened his grip on the handlebars. He's just a boy, but he's smart enough to know when danger's near. Later that afternoon, I saw a car pull up near the gate. This one was an HOA member I recognized. It was a black SUV with tinted windows, the kind that looks like it belongs to some security outfit or government agency. The driver didn't get out. He just sat there for a few minutes, engine running, then slowly drove away. Maybe it was nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. I went straight to the house and told Emily to keep the kids inside. I don't like scaring them, but I'd rather have them scared than unprepared. That night, I oiled and cleaned every firearm I owned, the rifle, my 12 gauge, the Glock I kept in the nightstand, and I set them where I could get to them quickly if I needed to. 2 days later, things finally came to a head. It was a Wednesday evening just before sunset when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. At first, I thought maybe it was a delivery truck or a neighbor stopping by, but when I stepped onto the porch, I saw 3 men walking through my gate. They weren't even trying to hide it. They were dressed casual, jeans and work boots, but each of them carried something. One had a length of chain in his hand, another had what looked like a baseball bat, and the third one, the tallest of the group, had a pistol tucked into his waistband. My dogs went nuts, barking and growling, and I yelled at Emily to get the kids inside and lock the door. I grabbed my rifle from just inside the doorway and chambered around. The sound of that alone made the two with the chain and the bat stop where they were, but the tall one just kept walking toward the house, smiling like this was some kind of game. I raised a rifle and shouted that they were trespassing and needed to leave immediately. The tall one finally stopped, maybe 20 yards from the porch, and shouted back that I was in violation of multiple HOA ordinances and that they were there to enforce compliance. The other two started laughing, and I could feel the adrenaline pounding in my ears. This wasn't some friendly warning. This wasn't a conversation. This was a threat, plain and simple. I told him again to leave, but instead of backing off, the tall one reached for the pistol at his waist. That's when time seemed to slow down. I knew in that instant I had a choice. Wait and see if he actually meant to draw on me, or act before he had the chance. I didn't have the luxury of hesitation, not with my wife and kids cowering inside the house. So I pulled the trigger. The shot echoed across the field, and the tall man dropped like a sack of feed. The other two bolted, chain and back clattering to ground as they ran back toward the gate. My hands were shaking. My chest felt like it was on fire, but I kept the rifle shouldered and waited until they were gone before I lowered it. Emily came running out, tears streaming down her face, and I told her to stay back until I made sure the man on the ground wasn't going to try anything. When I got closer, I saw he wasn't moving. The round had hit center mass. He still had his pistol half drawn, his fingers just inches from the grip. I don't know if he planned to shoot me or just scare me, but either way, he didn't get the chance. I called the sheriff immediately, told him what happened, and then sat on the porch with the rifle across my lap until they arrived. When the deputies got there, they treated me with the respect you'd expect out here. They took my statement, photographed the scene, and confirmed that the man had been armed. One of them even said quietly, "You did what you had to do." Still, they had to take the body and open an investigation, which I understood. I've always believed in the law, and I wasn't about to run from what I did, but I wasn't ashamed of it either. I protected my family. That night was one of the hardest of my life. The kids were scared and confused. Jacob tried to act tough, but I saw the tears he wiped away when he thought I wasn't looking. Lily wouldn't let go of Emily, clinging to her like a shadow. Emily sat with me at the kitchen table, holding my hand, not saying much. There wasn't much to say. We both knew this wasn't over. If anything, I'd just drawn a line in the sand, and I had no idea what would come next. The morning after the shooting, the ranch felt different. The air was heavy, almost too quiet, like even the birds knew what had happened. I woke before dawn, as I always did, but instead of heading straight for the barn, I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching the first streaks of light cut through the horizon. The gravel near the gate was still disturbed where the deputies' trucks had been parked, and there was a dark stain in the dirt where the man had fallen. It was a grim reminder that last night wasn't a bad dream. It was real, and as much as part of me wanted to push it out of my mind, I couldn't afford to. This wasn't just about what happened. This was about what might happen next. Around 8 o'clock, Sheriff Daniels himself drove up. I'd known Daniel for years. We'd gone to the same high school, though he was a few grades ahead of me, and I could tell by the look on his face that he wasn't there for a friendly chat. He asked if he could come in, and we sat at the kitchen table while Emily made a fresh pot of coffee. Daniels laid it out straight. The man I shot was indeed an HOA board member, and according to his wife, he'd told her he was going to handle the situation personally that evening. The pistol on his hip was unregistered, and he'd had a history of aggressive behavior. That would work in my favor legally, Daniels said, but there would still be a full investigation, and the district attorney might want to look at the case before making a final ruling. I told Daniels exactly what happened, step by step, leaving nothing out. He nodded along, asked a few follow-up questions, then told me he believed I'd acted in self-defense. But, he added, you should know that his buddies from the HOA are already making noise about pressing charges. They're claiming you lured him onto your property, and that you've been provoking them for months. I felt my jaw tighten. Provoking them? I'd done nothing but protect what was mine. Daniels must have seen the anger in my face because he leaned in and said quietly, I know how this looks, and I know what you're about. Just keep your head straight until this blows over. Don't go looking for a fight. I wanted to tell him that the fight was already here, that it had been here for weeks, creeping closer every day until it walked through my gate with a pistol in its waistband. But I bit my tongue and nodded. Daniels left with a promise to keep me updated, and for the rest of the morning, I worked the ranch like usual. It felt strange, mending fences and feeding cattle like nothing had happened, but that's what ranching life is. The work never stops, not even when your world been turned upside down. By late afternoon, the first signs of trouble started showing up. A pair of HOA members parked near the road, just beyond my property line, and started taking photos with their phones. I could see them pointing at the house, at the barn, even at my kids' tree swing. Emily came out onto the porch, worried, but I told her to get back inside and lock the door. I wasn't going to let them intimidate me, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a confrontation either. Not yet. After a few minutes, they drove away, but I knew they'd be back. That night, Emily and I sat down and had the hard conversation we'd been putting off. She asked if maybe it was time to consider selling the ranch, moving somewhere quieter, somewhere safer. I understood where she was coming from. She just wanted to protect the kids, but I couldn't even bring myself to imagine leaving. This land wasn't just dirt and grass to me. It was everything I'd worked for. It was where my kids were growing up, where I planned to grow old. If we left, it would mean they'd won. And I couldn't let that happen. I told Emily I'd do whatever it took to keep her and the kids safe, but we weren't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. The next few days were tense. The sheriff's office came back twice to collect more evidence and take more photos. I cooperated fully, but every time they left, I noticed more HOA members driving slowly past the gate, sometimes stopping, sometimes shouting insults before speeding off. They were testing me, trying to bait me into doing something stupid. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I doubled down on security. I installed 2 more cameras along the fence line, upgraded the locks on the gate, and even set up motion sensor lights around the house. At night, I kept a loaded shotgun propped by the back door and a rifle within arm's reach. One evening, just after sunset, I caught movement on one of the cameras. 3 figures were creeping along the eastern fence line, the side closest to the subdivision. I grabbed my rifle and stepped outside quietly, using the shadows to stay hidden as I made my way toward them. By the time I got close enough to see clearly, they had already spray painted something obscene on my fence and were trying to pry the boards loose. I shouted, and they bolted like deer, dropping their crowbar as they ran. I didn't fire. I wasn't about to shoot anyone in the back, but I did put a round in the air just to let them know I was serious. When I got back to the house, Emily was pale and shaking. She'd been watching from a window and thought for sure she was about to watch me kill another man. I hugged her, told her it was over, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. These weren't random acts of vandalism. This was pressure, intimidation. They wanted me scared enough to pack up and leave. They wanted me broken. The next morning, I found a letter nailed to my gate. It wasn't typed up on official letterhead this time. It was handwritten in big, angry scrawl. It said, "You've been warned. Next time, it won't just be a visit." That was the moment I realized we'd crossed a line we couldn't come back from. This wasn't about property values or HOA bylaws anymore. This was about control. And I knew, sooner or later, they were going to push until there was no choice left but to push back harder. 3 days after finding that letter nailed to my gate, I knew the storm was about to break. I could feel it in my bones. You live long enough out here, you learn to trust that feeling. The same way you can smell rain before a storm hits. The same way you can sense a rattlesnake before you see it. I didn't sleep much those nights. I kept the lights off in the house, sitting by the window with my rifle across my knees, watching the cameras on my phone. Every time a coyote howled in the distance or the wind slammed the barn door shut, my pulse spiked. Emily begged me to get some rest, but I couldn't. If I closed my eyes, all I could see was that HOA man lying in the dirt. All I could hear was a threat in that letter. I wasn't about to let my guard down and wake up to find something had happened to my wife or kids. The next attack came not with footsteps on the fence line, but with fire. It was around midnight when one of the motion sensors tripped, and I caught a flash of movement near the barn on the camera feed. Before I could even get out the door, flames were already licking up one side of the building. Someone had thrown a Molotov cocktail through the window and taken off running. I shouted for Emily to call 911 and ran for the barn, grabbing the fire extinguisher and hose as I went. The smoke was thick and choking. But by some miracle, I managed to put it out before the fire spread to the feed storage or the workshop. The damage was bad. Half the wall was scorched black. Some of my tools were ruined. But it could have been worse. Much worse. If I hadn't gotten out there when I did, the whole barn might have gone up. And if the wind had been blowing the other way, the house could have been next. By the time the deputies arrived, the attackers were long gone. They took photos, collected what little evidence there was, a broken bottle, some rags, and told me they put out a bolo for any suspicious vehicles. But I could see it in their faces. They didn't expect to find anyone. Out here, crimes like this have a way of disappearing into the dust. I stood there in the glow of the burned wall, fists clenched so hard my nails cut into my palms, and made a promise to myself that I was done waiting, done hoping they'd leave me alone. The next time they came onto my land, there wouldn't be any warnings. The next morning, I fortified the ranch like it was a fortress. I reinforced the gate with heavy steel brackets, strung more barbed wire along the weak spots in the fence, and mounted 2 more cameras on the barn. I even set up a motion alarm inside the tree line that would alert me if anyone crossed onto the property. Emily watched me work in silence, her face pale. When I was done, she came up and put her hands on my chest and said quietly, "Promise me you won't go looking for them." I kissed her forehead and told her I wouldn't. But in my heart, I knew it wasn't about looking for them anymore. They were coming, and it was only a matter of time. That night, the attack I'd been expecting finally came. It was around 2 a.m. when the alarm went off. A shrill, high-pitched sound that cut through the silence and jolted me out of the chair I'd been dozing in. I grabbed a rifle, flipped on the floodlights, and saw them. 3 figures, all masked this time, running across the pasture toward the house. One of them had something long and glinting in his hands, a crowbar or maybe a shotgun. My blood went cold. This wasn't vandalism anymore. This wasn't intimidation. This was a home invasion. I shouted for Emily to get the kids into the panic room we'd built in the basement when we first moved in. She didn't argue, just grabbed them and disappeared downstairs. I stepped out onto the porch, my rifle steady, my finger tight on the trigger. The men didn't stop. They didn't slow down. One of them shouted something I couldn't make out, and then I saw the flash of metal as he raised whatever he was carrying. I didn't wait. I fired once, then again, the shots cracking through night air. One of the figures went down immediately. The other 2 froze, then scrambled backward, disappearing into the darkness. I kept my sights trained on the one who'd fallen, shouting for him not to move. He didn't. By the time the deputies arrived, faster this time, maybe because of the fire last night, the man was already gone, dead, before they could even load him into the ambulance. They found the weapon he'd been carrying lying next to him. It was a shotgun, loaded and ready to fire. This time, Sheriff Daniels didn't mince words. "You just save your family's lives," he said. "Anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what it's like to live out here." Still, the law required another investigation, and I gave my statement again, calm and steady. I wasn't shaken this time. If anything, I felt a grim sense of relief. The line had been crossed, and I had answered, but the HOA wasn't done. The next day, I got a certified letter from their attorney accusing me of reckless endangerment and threatening to sue me for emotional distress on behalf of the dead man's family. I laughed out loud when I read it, a bitter, humorless laugh. They thought they could scare me with paperwork after sending armed men onto my land? Not a chance. I called my lawyer, a tough-as-nails woman named Karen who's handled ranch disputes for half the county, and she told me exactly what I wanted to hear. Let them try. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. That night, for the first time in weeks, I actually slept for more than an hour at a time. But I knew this wasn't truly over. People like that don't stop just because they lose. They regroup. They scheme. They wait for their next chance. And when they come back, because I knew they would, I'd be ready. A week passed after the last shooting, and for a short while, the ranch was quiet again. The cameras showed nothing but wandering deer and stray coyotes. The phone stopped ringing, and the HOA members seemed to keep their distance. At first, I thought maybe we'd finally scare them off for good, that maybe they realized how far they'd pushed things and decided it wasn't worth it anymore. Emily seemed to think so, too. She even started letting the kids play outside again in the late afternoons, watching from the porch with a smile I hadn't seen in weeks. For the first time since this nightmare started, I allowed myself to hope that life might go back to normal. But deep down, I knew better. That's the thing about predators. They don't give up when they smell blood. They regroup, they plan, and then they strike again. I stayed vigilant, even as I tried to enjoy the peace while it lasted. Every night, before I turned in, I made sure the gates were locked, the cameras were recording, and the rifle was within arm's reach. It was on a Friday night, just after sunset, when I heard the sound that confirmed my instincts were right. It wasn't the alarm this time or the barking of the dogs. It was a distant growl of engines, more than one, coming up the dirt road toward my gate. I stepped out onto the porch and saw the dust cloud before I saw the trucks. 2 of them, blacked out and roaring, stopped just outside the gate. 4 men got out, armed and dressed like they meant business. One of them carried a shotgun, another had a handgun, and the other 2 had bats and crowbars. They didn't look like they were here to talk. I shouted for Emily to get the kids into the panic room again, then grabbed the rifle and moved to the side of the porch, keeping low. My heart was pounding, but my mind was clear. This was it. This was the night everything came to a head. They broke through the gate with a chain and started advancing up the driveway. I had the high ground from the porch, and I wasn't about to give it up. I fired a warning shot into the dirt in front of them, shouting that this was private property and they needed to leave immediately. Instead of backing off, one of them raised his weapon and fired. The buckshot tore into the porch railing just feet from where I stood. That was all I needed to see. I returned fire, hitting the first man in the leg and dropping him instantly. The others scattered, one diving behind the hood of his truck, another running toward the side of the house. The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire, shouts, and a deafening echo of rounds cracking to the night air. I moved from one end of the porch to the other, using the posts as cover, returning fire when I had a clear shot. One of the men managed to get close enough to swing his crowbar at the porch steps, splintering one of them. But before he could climb up, I dropped him with a shot to the shoulder. He went down screaming, clutching his arm, and crawled back toward the gate. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, sirens wailing, lights flashing, the fight was over. Two of the men had fled in the trucks, tearing up the dirt road in a cloud of dust, but the other two were lying on the ground, wounded but alive. The deputies cuffed them and hauled them away, while Sheriff Daniels came up to the porch to check on me. I told him I was fine, though my hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. Emily and the kids stayed in the panic room until the deputies gave the all clear, and when they finally came out, Lily ran straight into my arms and wouldn't let go. The next day, Daniels came back with good news. The two men who'd been arrested had confessed that they were acting on orders from the HOA president himself, the same smug man who'd first come to my door with that clipboard weeks ago. Turns out he'd been using HOA funds to pay these guys to harass me, hoping to force me off my land, so he could buy it cheap and flip it for profit. When the district attorney heard the whole story, he dropped any thought of pressing charges against me, and instead opened a case against the HOA leadership. It took months for everything to settle, but in the end, justice finally caught up with them. The HOA president was arrested for conspiracy, trespassing, and multiple counts of harassment. The association was dissolved by court order, and their fancy gated community was left without leadership. Some of the neighbors moved away. Others just kept to themselves, but nobody bothered me again. Life slowly returned to normal. The kids went back to riding their bikes up and down the dirt road. Emily started tending to her garden again, and I went back to fixing up trucks in the barn. The scars were still there on the fence, on the porch, in our minds, but we learned to live with them. Every now and then, I'd catch Emily watching me when I was working, her eyes still carrying that quiet worry, but then she'd smile and shake her head like she couldn't believe everything we'd been through. One evening, as the sun was setting and the sky was painted with streaks of gold and crimson, Jacob asked me if I ever regretted what happened. I looked out across the pasture, at the land I had fought so hard to keep, and shook my head. No, I said quietly. I did what I had to do to protect this family. This is our home. No one takes that away from us. That night, after the kids were in bed, Emily and I sat on the porch, sipping coffee in the quiet. The stars were out, bright and endless, and for the first time in a long time, the night didn't feel threatening. It felt like it used to, calm, peaceful, ours. I put my arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into me. The fight was over. The ranch was safe. And as long as I was alive, always would be,